the BBC has done today is extraordinary. It's written, in effect, a grovelling letter to a sitting US president apologising for an error of judgment, promising to never to rebroadcast the programme, and yet insisting there's no basis for defamation and no basis for a cheque for 9 zeros. It is half capitulation, half legal stonewall. And hanging over all this is the question, what about Newsnight? If Panorama needs an apology, how on earth does the earlier Newsnight splice not demand one too? How many times can a broadcaster take the same speech, cut it in the same way, and still swear blind there's no systemic problem? Starting with the basics. The BBC has now accepted formally that the Panorama edit of Trump's 6th of January speech created a mistaken impression, that it suggested a direct call to violent action that he did not literally utter in that sequence. The famous "we're going to walk down to the Capitol" line and the we fight like hell, they come almost an hour apart in the original. They were welded together into a neat, incriminating soundbite in a film broadcast a week before the US election. That alone should be combustible, and to it a leaked memo from Michael Prescott, an independent standards advisor, accusing the BBC of serious and systemic bias and saying managers refused to accept that there'd been a breach. Then stir in Trump's favourite diet of grievance, victimhood and litigation, and you have exactly the legal circus we're now enjoying. From the BBC's side, the argument is clear. The documentary was UK only, not broadcast on US channels. Trump was re-elected afterwards, which hardly screams overwhelming reputational harm. The edit, they insist, was a clumsy shortening of a very long speech, not malicious invention, and in any US court they would be protected by the First Amendment, high thresholds for defamation, and the requirement that Trump prove not only that the clip was misleading, but that they knew it and pressed on anyway. This is why, in legal terms, the BBC is probably right to hold its ground on compensation. In Brighton or in Florida, it's not obvious that he has a winning case. In political terms, though, the BBC is in a much weaker position because the problem is no longer just one edit in one Panorama. Enter Newsnight stage left, clutching the same speech, the same scissors, wielded in pretty well the same way. We now know that back in June 2022, Newsnight broadcast its own spliced version of Trump's 6th of January speech, once again linking "we're going to walk down to the Capitol" with we fight like hell, and if we don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore," without any visual cue that the edit bridged a near 1 hour gap. Crucially, this was not some secret flaw discovered years later. Mick Mulvaney, Trump's former chief of staff, challenged the edit on air in real time. He politely but firmly said, "Your video spliced this together. The fight like hell line comes later in the speech. You are making it look as though he said something in one continuous passage that he did not say that way." And what happened? Kirsty Walk moved on the next day, according to the whistleblower. Producers asked, "How did that go out?" in the morning meeting, and the concern was brushed aside. No correction, no clarification, no apology. The clip sat there as if it were perfectly standard journalism. And that is why this now looks less like an isolated lapse, more like a pattern. Not a secret conspiracy dreamed up in a smoke-filled room, but a settled editorial reflex. When Trump is the subject and the story is the riot, it is simply taken for granted that you can compress, sharpen, and make the rhetoric as incriminating as possible, and anyone querying that is being awkward rather than professional. Which brings us back to the main question. Another apology? Will it ever stop? On the narrow point, I cannot see how the BBC avoids conceding that the Newsnight clip was wrong by the standards it's now set for itself. If the Panorama edit was unintentionally creating the impression of a direct call to violence, the Newsnight edit did exactly the same thing 2 years earlier, and did so after a live pushback from a well-informed guest. If a later programme is judged worthy of a personal letter from Samir Shah to the White House, an agreement never to show it again, and 2 senior resignations, what possible defence is there for the earlier ones staying uncorrected and unacknowledged? On any consistent analysis, Newsnight needs its own clarification, probably its own apology, and at least one internal explanation of how the challenge from Mulvaney and the concerns in the post-programme meeting were allowed to evaporate. But the more important question is not how many apologies, but what is being apologised for. The BBC says repeatedly that it holds itself to the highest standards. The trouble is that the high standards are not what you write in your charter. They're what you enforce when it is inconvenient. If a critical programme about Trump, broadcast just before a US election, can splice his words in a way that materially sharpens his apparent culpability, and if a flagship current affairs programme can do the same thing 2 years earlier, then the failing is not only in the edit suite, it's in the chain of editorial sign-off, in the culture that treats certain politicians as narratively guilty before the evidence is assembled, and in the managerial instinct to minimise errors until the scandal forces contrition. You can see this playing out in the politics around the BBC too. Keir Starmer insists he supports a strong and independent BBC, but tells it to get its house in order when mistakes are made. Ed Davey urges him to tell Trump he will not see a penny of licence fee money. Daisy Cooper suggests that attacks on the BBC are dodgy and politically motivated, which of course many of them are. Reform pulls out of a BBC documentary citing the loss of trust. Two things can be true at once. There are definitely actors on the British right who are delighted to use this as a pretext to undermine, defund or replace the BBC with something closer to Fox. But there's also a real editorial failure here that gives those actors ammunition. Weaponization works only when someone hands you the weapon. The BBC now has several problems layered on top of each other. There's the legal problem with Trump, which in truth is less terrifying than the lawyers would like you to think. There's the reputational problem with British audiences, who are now asked to believe that two strikingly similar edits of the same speech broadcast years apart were innocent, isolated attempts at helpful shortening. And there is the institutional problem revealed by Michael Prescott's memo, a reluctance to admit breaches of standards, especially when they align with the political instincts of much of the newsroom. Will it ever stop? Depends entirely on whether this leads to anything more than theatrical remorse. If all that happens is a few carefully layered apologies, some departures at the top, and a modest tightening of guidance on editing political speeches, then the deeper issue will remain. Journalists will still know, in their bones, that certain targets are fair game for aggressive treatment, and that objections can be waved away as pedantry or bad faith. If instead the BBC took this as a moment for radical honesty, a few things would follow. It would explicitly bar the splicing together of non-contiguous political quotes without clear on-screen signalling and verbal explanation. It would create a robust internal mechanism where on-air challenges like Mulvaney's are investigated, not ignored. It would publish an independent review of how political stories are framed across multiple issues to test whether the charge of systemic bias has substance beyond the Trump case, and it would stop behaving as though the only threats to its impartiality come from external populists rather than its own blind spots. Well, one apology to Donald Trump is not going to destroy the BBC. Neither will a second apology for Newsnight if and when it comes. What really threatens the institution is the sense that it will apologise for being caught, but not fundamentally change the habits that got it into trouble. So yes, I would expect at least one more apology before the saga is over. The more interesting question, and the one that licence fees payers should be asking, is whether apologies become a substitute for reform or the beginning of reform. And I'm not talking about Reform UK there, I'm talking about genuine reform.